The doors are now shut. There is no escape. Welcome to all of you and to our Zooming people. It's wonderful that we can all be together. Tom is no stranger to you. We have enjoyed hearing him present on various things, and I believe his most recent one was about his journey down to the south with his daughter on a sort of a justice journey. And what he's talking about today is a result. Jeepers, guys, there's supposed to be no escape here, and you're all leaving. Anyway, his topic for today about First Nations and what the church is seeking in terms of relationship with First Nations, also in terms of justice and restitution. That interest began on his journey that he took with his daughter a couple of years ago. So we are very excited to hear what Tom has to say for us today, and please welcome him.
If I could have that first slide, Richard. Thank you. As Sue mentioned, this class is designed to educate ourselves as the dominant culture relative to our relationship with the Native peoples and the Native tribes. And the conference has been fairly upfront about the importance of trying to reestablish a qualified and a good relationship between ourselves as United Methodists and the Native peoples. In 2014, in fact, our bishop, Elaine Stanovsky, led a group of 650 Rocky Mountain Conference members to the site of the Sand Creek Massacre down in Colorado. And the reason that she went and the reason that she wanted to go was to describe the need for what she referred to as a religious pilgrimage. And the religious pilgrimage became important to our bishop because she had indicated that much of the relationship between the church and the Native peoples was much darker and much more strained than we had previously understood. And as a result of that, she has been catapulted as really a leader in the Western states regarding this movement to try and improve the relationship between the church and our Native peoples. During our time here this morning, I'm going to ask you to engage with what we're going to be talking about with a mix of Native eyes and ears and Caucasian eyes and ears. We have a tendency when we talk about other cultures and other people to view them solely through the eyes of a Caucasian individual. And as a consequence of that, all of the conditioning and culturalization and socialization and all that goes with that ability to evaluate something is colored significantly by our upbringing experiences and teachings. So we have to kind of set that aside to some degree and put on the lenses of what you would perceive to be at least an open idea and an opening to being open to what the Native peoples had to experience. If we don't do that, we will never make significant progress in creating a new relationship with our Native tribes. If we continue to look at their circumstances and their conditions simply through the eyes of white people, we are never going to be able to fully understand their needs and the importance of being able to meet them halfway. I ask you to hold on to another principle as well. Just because we are going to face up to somewhat ugly and unchristian history of our denomination and some of the folks that acted on behalf of the Methodist Church, that does not translate into a condemnation of the church. So when I am critical of the Methodist Church, it is because there is an importance associated with being critical in a positive way and making our jump into a new relationship with our Native peoples. If we just simply continue to whitewash the fact that there have been some terrible things undertaken by white people to Native peoples, we are never going to get there. So I ask that you at least don those two changes in the way that you listen to what we're doing here today. Richard, could I have slide 2, please? With that introduction, let's start where the church is today. The church has acknowledged that we have caused harm to our Native peoples. If you look at what our bishop has said here, the Christian church has done deep and lasting harm to indigenous peoples and cultures around the world for centuries. And the World Council of Churches has also joined in. The ways of life, identities, well-being, and the very existence of the indigenous people are threatened by the continuing effects of colonization and national policies, regulations, and laws that attempt to force them to assimilate into the culture of majoritarian societies. So once again, we continue to try and force Native peoples to conform with the mores and the protocols and the systems and standards of white society. And as a consequence of that, we continue to do great harm to Native peoples as a result of that. Could you please put up slide 3, Richard? The relationship, though, between Christianity and Native peoples occurs much further back in history than just simply our own personal history. If we go back even further to the 14th century, specifically 1492, which is a date every last one of us learn in elementary school, was the date that Columbus discovered America and did great things. That is all we learned about what Columbus did. We did not hear about the other things Columbus did and his forebears. So when we look at this now, we need to go back and try to figure out, how did the church become the instrument of these kinds of policies? How is it that the church was able to set aside its scripture to the degree that Native peoples became an enemy and that Native peoples were no longer viewed as children of God? Okay, how did that happen? Well, the church had a great deal to do with that. The relationship between Christianity and indigenous people was long governed by an attitude that was created in the teachings and attitudes of Pope Nicholas V in 1492. And he essentially executed what is known as a papal bulletin, a papal bull. And a papal bull is a document that is issued by the Pope back in the 12th, 13th, 14th, 15th centuries, which operated to lay down the law, if you will, between the various parties that were involved. And at that time, that was important because the church was perceived as the arbitrator between nations and how they entered into the relationship with one another. And in 1492, when the Pope issued this particular proclamation, it was in response to a dispute between Portugal and Spain. And Portugal and Spain were disputing who had the right to various lands along the African coast and elsewhere. And so they went to the Pope, and the Pope was the person who then explained what the rules were going to be for colonization and for moving into what is at that time considered the New World. And so when we look at what is going on in the country at that, and in those days, we go back to this thing called the Doctrine of Discovery. And the Doctrine of Discovery says this: indigenous people have the oldest living cultures in the world. 300 to 500 million indigenous people today live in the world, in 72 countries, and they comprise at least 5,000 distinct peoples. The ways of life, identities, well-being, and very existence of indigenous people are threatened, and a fundamental historical basis and legal precedent for these policies and laws is the doctrine of discovery. The idea that Christians enjoy a moral and legal right based solely on their religious identity to invade and seize indigenous lands and to dominate indigenous peoples, okay? Another writer approached this doctrine and said this of it: explorers in Africa and America were essentially given permission by the church to do the following: invade, search out, capture, vanquish, and subdue all Saracens, today called Muslims, and pagans whatsoever, and other enemies of Christ wheresoever placed, and the kingdoms, dukedoms, principalities, dominions, possessions, and all movable and immovable goods whatsoever, held and possessed by them, and to reduce their persons to perpetual slavery, and to apply and appropriate to principalities, dominions, possessions, and goods, and to convert them to their use and profits. Okay? The teaching or the doctrine of the church essentially says that whatever Christians discover as they leave Europe and head out into what's now known as the New World, they can take and do as they wish. So automatically we have incorporated into Christian thinking now supremacy ideas, the idea that we as Euro-Christians are supreme to everybody else. And that turns out to be white versus all other colors. Brian McLaren, we're all familiar with him. In his book, The Great Spiritual Migration, observed this of this doctrine. Christian global mission is defined as to invade, search out, capture, vanquish, and subdue non-Christians around the world, and to steal all movable and immovable goods, and to reduce their persons to perpetual slavery. And not only them, but their descendants. And notice the stunning use of the word convert, to convert their property to our use and purposes. A little different approach to the idea of conversion from the Christian perspective. But this is what dominated Christian thinking as the New World was opened up by these explorers. Now, this document has the basis for Christian justification of colonialism and the building of all of those Euro-Christian empires, Spanish, Portuguese, British, Dutch, French, German, and all the other Euro-Christian empires, all set sail on the basis that they had a superior belief in themselves as superior individuals, that everybody else that they came into contact was by definition inferior. They were Saracens, they were Muslims, they were Indians, they were anybody but us. So as we review our relationship with Native peoples, keep in mind how this attitude is reflected in the policies and proposals that were passed by Americans at the time that we were now exercising our own manifest destiny as we moved from the eastern part of the country to the western part of the country. Those original fellows are now putting into that plan of manifest destiny an attitude that the church has imbued in them, and that is that you are superior to all other peoples and places that you come into contact with. So keep in mind that this is the attitude with which the United States begins to move west. One of the most visible examples of where the church is now trying to be more transparent and truthful about the relationship we've had and the church's role in harming the land, culture, and children of our native peoples is in its efforts to repent for the church's involvement in the forced removal of native children from their families through a government system of boarding schools. Recently, the remains of over 1,000 children have been discovered on the grounds of a variety of different boarding schools around the United States and in Canada. From the 19th century until around 1970 in the United States, we ran a residential school system to, quote, re-educate, end quote, Native children. Now, Native children, based on a belief that it was necessary to force that generation to assimilate into white culture. Why? Because if you want to change the direction of any generation of people, you start with their children. And if you change the trajectory of the thinking of children, you change the trajectory of what they will do as adults. And the United States was pursuing a policy that was specifically designed to take those children and change what they were and create what we wanted them to be. The whole focus of the boarding school program was designed to, quote, kill the Indian, but save the man. This is the underlying premise of the boarding school system here in the United States. This was accomplished by denying Native children an ability to practice their culture, language, in favor of the dominant culture's attire and language. They could no longer speak their native tongue. They had to speak English. They no longer could wear native dress. They had to dress as we do in the West. Native children were not permitted to speak their native tongue. If they did, they were beaten. They had to wear they could not wear native dress. They were not permitted to practice spiritual rituals that they had practiced for thousands of years and had to forcibly replace those with Christian rituals. That was the responsibility of these schools. Richard, could you give me slide 4? Probably the most insidious device used in this assimilation effort was the boarding school system here in the United States. And the boarding school system was insidious in that it operated to involuntarily remove Native children from their tribes and their families and physically, forcibly relocate them sometimes 1,000 miles away to boarding schools that were being managed predominantly by religious denominations. And when we look and we see what that looks like here in the United States, the responsibility for the boarding school system was both secular and religious. And of the religious institutions that came forward and answered the government's call to establish and maintain and manage these schools, you can see there's a list of them there. First on the left is the denomination. And on the right are the number of Indian children that were managed by those denominations. So you can see we Methodists, we had over 54,000 children that were in our custody, care, and control over a period of time during that 19th century to 1970s, where we as a denomination operated to work on killing the Indian and saving the man. Okay, so we are culpable in the approach that we took to Native peoples in that we absolutely attacked them from an important position. What's very important to remember too is that this attempt to break these children out of their tribes was followed by yet another attempt to break up the tribes that was involuntarily. And that was that when the children were removed from their tribal families, many of those tribes picked up, put everything on their horses and followed their children to wherever they were going to be placed in a boarding school for no other reason than to simply be in the same general vicinity of their children. They were not allowed to see their kids. Out here at Fort Spokane, we had a number of tribal members that left the tribe and they came and camped out at Fort Spokane, or at least near the fort, at least knowing that their children were there and at least they could know that. They never saw them. They never interacted with them. But that operated to now uproot yet again other individuals within the tribes and causing them to become increasingly fragmented across the United States. So that's what this slide is designed to tell us. The lasting hurt this has caused was made painfully clear on September 30th, when my News Story Spokane group and I went out to Fort Spokane and we joined the Spokane tribe and some of the other tribes that were there to support them in honoring the children that were killed out at Fort Spokane's boarding school. And it was just painful to sit and listen to what now were formerly members of those boarding schools, children that had been removed from their families and taken to the boarding schools. And it was painful to listen to them now as elders in their tribes talking about that experience and the loss of their families and the loss of their culture and all that has transpired as a result of that. It brought tears to my eyes to sit and listen to the idea that we, at least in part, played a role in tribes getting to a place that they no longer have an ability to advance themselves as the way white people have been able to do it. In Canada, more than 150,000 Indigenous children were forced to attend state-funded schools, boarding schools, in their own effort to assimilate their children, those children, into Canadian society. We've learned that thousands of those children here and in the United States and in Canada were killed as a result of that. Well, how did they die? They died by abuse. They were beaten. They died by diseases that were brought that were not indigenous to the locales here in the West, smallpox and all of the other measles and the other things that the Europeans brought to this continent were not indigenous to this area. As a result, the indigenous people paid a huge price for all of that. And understand that we had no vaccines back in those days. We had whole tribes wiped out simply because they were exposed to things that they had previously never been exposed to. So how many kids are we talking about? The Native American International Caucus of the United Methodist Church has written this: between 1869 and the 1960s, hundreds of thousands of Native American children were removed, often violently, from their homes and families and placed in these schools. There were 367 government-funded Native American Indian boarding schools, according to the National Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition. Many were run by the church. Children at many of these schools were regularly beaten, had their hair forcibly cut, and their traditional expressions of sacred identity stolen and destroyed. They were starved, physically abused, or mutilated for speaking their native languages or for attempting to preserve their culture. They were emotionally and sexually abused. The schools were typically overcrowded, unsanitary, and provided poor education and medical services, resulting in the rapid spread of disease and illness. Children were frequently hired out to local landowners and residents to perform forced labor, and then treated as animals or worse by their overseers. This intersection between the dominant white culture and native cultures has left Native peoples stripped of their culture, their land, their language, and their potential for wealth development. These boarding schools were possible because the dominant white culture adopted a doctrine that Native peoples were inferior to Caucasian people. Let's be honest about it. The whole idea was that we were superior by virtue of the fact that we were Christian and we were white to every other being on this planet. And as a result of that underlying belief that was so strongly held in this country, we allowed that to seep into all of our policies as we moved west. And that generated the types of policies that we were going to follow as we ran into Native peoples across the country. Bishop Stanovsky has asked the United Methodist Church to address this historical harm and talk about how we can fix it. To begin, to more appropriately acknowledge the harm the church has done, the General Conference of the United Methodist Church adopted a resolution, quote, affirming the sacredness of the American Indian people, their languages, cultures, and gifts to the church and to the world. It goes on to state, quote, it was a common experience of Native families to have their children forcibly removed from their care and sent to boarding schools operated by religious institutions, including the Methodist Church. Now, having officially acknowledged this role, the Methodist Church is now attempting to atone for some of the harm that we have caused. And again, our bishop has been instrumental in taking that on and being a leader in that regard. The Native American International Caucus of the United Methodist Church has called on the Methodist Church to do the following: to discover the locations and records from the Methodist-run boarding schools, to search the physical properties for individuals or mass graves by whatever means necessary, and to make a determined effort to provide surviving family members with the information that you find. We demand the church search out, listen to, and collect the oral stories of those family members whose ancestors were impacted by a Methodist boarding school. So what does this healing process look like for us? For some of European descent, it's going to be very difficult to both respect our ancestors while at the same time condemning what they did to Native peoples. And that's an incredibly difficult thing sometimes for white people to do, because it sounds like we're just simply being critical and ignoring all the good that those white settlers did. Not at all. They did a great deal of good, just not to the Native peoples, okay? So what does it look like? At the current heart of the dispute over our statues that are coming down and streets being renamed, such as George Wright Drive being renamed for Chief Qualchan's wife, Wistocks, those kinds of things, that's the heart of what's going on in this country, is an attempt to try and begin a process of atoning for the things that have happened in the past. And in those conditions, we're talking about the relationship between Black and white America, which in my opinion is a failed social experiment, okay? But we've done the same thing with our Native peoples. Could I have slide 5, Richard? We need to be prepared to admit that some of our ancestors of import led to cultural genocide by stripping Native kids of their language, faith systems, and physical connection and access to their own peoples. Here's a statement that was given to us by Martin Luther King prior to his death. Our nation was born in genocide when it embraced the doctrine that the original American, the Indian, was an inferior race. Even before there were large numbers of Negroes on our shore, the scar of racial hatred had already disfigured colonial society. From the 16th century forward, blood flowed in battles over racial supremacy. We are perhaps the only nation which tried, as a matter of national policy, to wipe out its indigenous population. Moreover, we elevated that tragic experience into a noble crusade. Indeed, even today, we have not permitted ourselves to reject or feel remorse for this shameful episode. Our literature, our films or drama or folklore, all exalt it. Our children are still taught to respect the violence which reduced a red-skinned people of an earlier culture into a few fragmented groups, herded into impoverished reservations. The church's responsibility for this harm is not confined to its involvement in the management of these boarding schools. It is also responsible for creating, as the United States moved west, the church was responsible for creating the atmosphere in the West that made these things possible. And so not only do we have a responsibility for the harm caused by the boarding schools, but as a denomination, we need to take some responsibility for creating the atmosphere in the West that led to some of these atrocities. Can I have 6, please, Richard? In the book, Hidden History of Portland, historian J.D. Chandler wrote this: the Methodist missions were notably unsuccessful at converting Indians to Christianity or saving them in any other way. But they were successful at 2 things: popularizing the idea that the Indians would soon be extinct and creating huge interest in Oregon back in the States. Oregon was only a territory at that time. The belief that all Indians would disappear was the reigning ideology of expansion. As soon as you begin to think that somebody else is going to be extinct, it becomes incredibly easy to help that along and to adopt policies that automatically will result on that. Why fight it? Okay. And that's in part what our church was responsible for. But it isn't confined only to Oregon and the Northwest. In 1864, the Colorado Territorial Governor, John Evans, who was a Methodist, is credited with helping to create the climate in which the Sand Creek Massacre happened in that territory. He defended the military commander, a Methodist clergyman turned soldier, Colonel John Chivington, who ordered the slaughter of over 200 men, women, and children, natives at the Sand Creek. This defense came despite a US congressional investigation of the incident, which found that the military had, quote, surprised and murdered in cold blood unsuspecting men, women, and children at Sand Creek. So as members of the dominant culture, we have a responsibility, I think, to acknowledge our role in historical wrongs. Did you and I go out and do these terrible things? No. But we have a responsibility to atone for things done by those that preceded us, that have left us with the benefits of their labor, their work, and their history. I think we have to take those benefits along with the detriments and do something about the detriments. The reality is that many Christian denominations, Catholic, Presbyterian, Episcopal, Baptist, Methodist, Quaker, Jesuit, all participated in the harm that has been inflicted on our native peoples. And they all bear some responsibility for trying to take care of these problems. Groups like the Native American International Caucus of the United Methodist Church and the Boarding School Healing Project are beginning to move the church towards reconciliation and reckoning with our native peoples. My hope is that this class has helped us to increase our understanding of the situation that exists between ourselves and the native peoples. But before you remove your native glasses, consider putting them on occasionally. When you read about issues involving indigenous people or hear news reports about those issues, try doing this for a change. For example, when you read or hear about the plight of the salmon, don't think about that situation simply as the potential loss of a terrific meal at Anthony's. Think about how much the native people who depend on the salmon the salmon run from Alaskan tribes to those continental tribes in the northwestern United States, where half of their food supply is based upon catching salmon. There are no more salmon to catch. And as a consequence of that, they continue to have a dwindling resource, again, caused by the actions of white people. When you hear about the government proposing to cut millions of acres out of traditional native lands that have been set aside specifically for their people in order to allow our businesses to mine the resources, cut the trees, and extract the oil and gas, alongside the issue of jobs that will be created, put on your native lenses and view the matter in the context of the original theft of tens of millions of acres of land from native peoples throughout the Western migration, with the resulting harms that have been caused today. The theft of native land is continuing today. The last administration reduced native lands known as the Bears Ears National Monument in Utah by 82% in order to afford business and industry the right to mine and log it. Similar action was taken against other tribal lands by the last administration in Utah and Rhode Island. Occasionally consider your own condition compared to those of a native family. We live on land that belonged to members of the Spokane tribe. The title to that land, however, originates with the white settlers in this area. It does not originate with any member of the Spokane tribe, and we didn't buy it from them. How much wealth has been created in white culture in the Western United States as a result of all of the behaviors of manifest destiny, of moving from east to west, taking lands that didn't belong to us, logging them, mining them, resource attractions that brought us out here, like gold in California. All of those things benefited the Caucasian race, but not the native race. How much wealth has been created and transferred to white people at the expense of native peoples? Had native peoples owned all that land and continued to be allowed to have it, imagine the logging and the mining and all of the other things that the native tribes could potentially have done with those lands, and in the consequence, raise some wealth for their own families. When industry proposes an oil and gas pipeline through sacred land and burial grounds of our native brothers and sisters, don't immediately go to the idea of how many jobs that's going to create. Instead, ask how you would feel if that was being proposed to be put through your cemetery with your relatives uprooted and moved. So what can we do to advance the interests of reconciliation between our church communities and our native communities? This is a significant issue for Spokane and a large segment of our population. Could I have the next slide, Richard? I'm sorry, I missed this once before. We were talking about the Methodist violence in Oregon, and this is from the minutes of one of the Methodist meetings in Oregon. It said, "This is for the plan to exterminate the Indians in the Rogue Valley." And this historian notes from the meetings at that Methodist meeting, only one voice was raised against this proposed killing spree, an abolitionist Englishman named John Beeson. This historian notes that Mr. Beeson was told by one man that it was the Methodist preachers themselves who had convinced him to go out and kill Indians. Mr. Beeson was forced to flee Oregon after his house was burned down and his family threatened for defending Indians. Could I have the next slide, Richard? This is what Spokane currently looks like. As a result of the last census, we now know that Spokane has the 8th largest urban Indian population in the United States, and it's growing. Between 2010 and 2020 census, Spokane's native community grew by about 10,000 people. So about 1,000 people from the native tribes a year are coming into Spokane. Today, there are 25,000 native people in Spokane, and it's believed that that is an undercount. Can I have the next slide, please, Richard? So what can we do? The National Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition has asked in churches and invited churches to do the following: to join the coalition as an ally at boardingschoolshealing.org, to disseminate research and information on the denomination's involvement in the boarding school program, which is what we're doing today. Develop and adopt official statements of acknowledgement and apology in consultation with the coalition and affected Native communities to take appropriate actions to make amends. And finally, to call on Congress and the President to establish a national commission to learn the truth about the impacts of the boarding school program on Native communities. Could I have the next slide, please, Richard? Some additional ideas are these. Read some literature by local Native authors like Sherman Alexie and about the Native history of this area, and talk about that in our book studies. Read about and visit some of the Native sites of significance in our local area as part of learning more about Native culture. My New Story Spokane group is in the process currently of developing a 5 to 6 hour Native American plunge into the civil rights of our local Native American peoples. And when we have that prepared, we will announce that and we'll give you an opportunity to participate in that 6 hour visit to the various sites around Spokane. The New Story community I belong to is working on a 5 to 6 hour Native civil rights pilgrimage, and we'll let you all know about that. And add a land acknowledgement statement as a church to our website, acknowledging that this is not our land. It may be legally our land, but it ultimately belonged to the Native peoples of Spokane. And I think it's important that we acknowledge that publicly. And finally, attend local events sponsored by the tribes, like the powwow and the memorial gathering at Fort Spokane on October 6th for those harmed by the Fort's boarding school program. I hope that you've had an opportunity to allow your Native lenses to stay on as much as possible during this presentation and begin to see the perspective of our Native peoples from their point of view. Too often we confine ourselves to information and knowledge that has been sifted and gone through and editorialized to the point that we don't want to make anybody unhappy or uncomfortable. And so we do that. The people that win normally write the history books. And as a consequence, we have a whole generations of Native peoples that have been simply written out of the history of the United States, particularly the Western United States, to any significant degree. My hope is that you will kind of begin to come in line with the idea that the church has a responsibility to do something to make some atonement and some amends for that in whatever ways that you feel comfortable doing. It may be giving a gift to the Native tribes. It may be attending some of their cultural events in order to show solidarity with them. Any number of things that you can do would certainly be appreciated by all of the various tribes. Thank you for taking some time to spend and listen with me this morning. And at that point, is there anybody that have any questions? Carol. Oh.
Were there any Methodist schools like you described in this area?
I'm not aware of any Methodist schools in the area. The only one I'm familiar with is the one at Fort Spokane, and I'm not sure who managed that. It could have been a secular school there as well.
I would just recommend to all who are interested in the Northwest indigenous peoples and how they have been treated to read Timothy Egan's The Good Rain. It's a very insightful and attractive read.
Thank you.
It's written by Timothy Egan, The Good Rain. Yes.
Any other questions? Thank you for listening, everybody.